What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G. Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network, on Peacock, and on Vice TV. As today we're talking Season 1, Episode 3 of Tales from the Territories, AWA, Bodyslams, and the Heartland was the name of this episode. I am a bit backed up on the show. This was Episode 3 that aired 2 weeks ago. Episode 4 aired this past week. I was away for that one, so I missed that one. And Episode 5 is coming up on Tuesday. So, obviously, I just watched Episode 3. That review is up now. Episode 4, that review should hopefully be up a little bit later in the week, and then Episode 5 at some point soon after. So I'm hoping to catch up and get back in real time and put the reviews up soon after they air, but I'm not sure how many episodes are left actually in Season 1. There might be 8 episodes total, so hoping to catch up and get back to watching them as they air in the near future. But I thought this was an enjoyable episode. We had a new cast here for this one, a new crew to share stories with. The first two dealing with Memphis and the Andy Kaufman story with Jerry Lawler. Those featured the same two crews. This one had a different group of characters. This one had Greg Gagne, which is pretty obvious considering his dad, Vern Gagne, ran the AWA. So we have Greg Gagne, Medusa, Diamond Dallas Page, Jim Brunzell, and Ken Patera, all of whom spending time in the AWA. So Gagne talks about, or rather Greg, I got to specify here, Vern Gagne passed away a couple of years ago. Greg talks about how he started on the ring truck when he was young, becoming a referee early on in his career, and how he would wrestle in like the ground floor of his house with his dad growing up until like he was an adult. Greg actually was the one who convinced Brunzell says, to join wrestling. DDP talks about how, and he's shared this story a million times, about how he thought he was too old to wrestle at the age of 31, so he became a manager and started the Diamond Exchange. And I think Medusa was one of the people he managed early on. Medusa talks about getting that opportunity to compete for the AWA. Patera, before joining wrestling, was in bodybuilding. He was super big into bodybuilding. He was actually named the strongest man in America, and he brought that. I'd say gimmick, but it wasn't exactly a gimmick. That was real life. He brought that fame to the AWA, which was a great platform for him to kind of start off his wrestling career. Greg shares the story of Ric Flair almost quitting in the barn, the famed barn that people would train in and stuff like that. And Flair almost quit after being inside the barn, and Fern slapped him across the face and said, "You're not fucking quitting." And that was it. Thankfully, he saved Ric Flair's career. It's not as if he went on to have a Hall of Fame career or anything like that, So, anyway, Gagne talks about how he would throw wrestlers in a plane. How Vern would throw wrestlers in a plane called the Suicide One to transport people from one place to another to make the shows. He talks a lot about how physical Mad Dog Vachon was. They talk a lot about Mad Dog Vachon, who passed away several years ago. Brunzell admits to carrying medication with him around at all times, and now he would give it to people like Vachon upon asking for it. Vachon took 2 of the pills that Brunzell gave him. In addition to drinking beer, he drank whiskey, did Vachon. He had fucking barbecue sauce all over his shirt. He was an absolute mess. He took Quaaludes and stuff like that. He actually got to the point where he was so fucked up and high off these drugs and drinking and whatever, when they were in said plane, he had the door open while the plane was in flight, like in the air, and he had the door open, like almost threatening to jump out. And everyone was like, "Oh, fuck this, I'm not dealing with this." Ultimately, he was fine. They got back to the ground level. The police, wherever they were, I forgot where it was, threatened to arrest him. And they said, "Listen, we can either arrest him here or you take his ass back and we don't see him again." And Vachon said, "You guys better take my ass back to where we were, otherwise we're all in fucking trouble and I'll kill you all." So they did. They took him back to where he was, or where they flew from originally. And I think they strapped him to the back of the airplane or whatever on their way back, which was pretty funny. So Medusa also talks about being brought into the AWA strictly for a program with Sherry Martel. And she was going to shit herself. She was so nervous and anxious about working with the legend that was Sherry Martel. She recalls this story where she was driving behind Martel and Doug Summers, I believe his name was, and how they were all super, I don't know if it was drugged up or drunk or whatever, and they stopped at Dairy Queen, I think it was, beforehand, and Martel took the milkshakes and threw them at the car that Medusa was in, and then Doug Summers was mooning people from his car, from the same car, I believe. They actually drove into a ditch, and it did not pay out well for them, and Medusa's car just kept on going, which was pretty funny. And she also talked about how she got her first $800 paycheck from AWA, and she used it to buy markers for her graves, the graves of her family. I think it was maybe her mom and her aunt, or her grandmother and her aunt, or something along those lines. She was very poor getting into the AWA, and that was a massive, the most amount of money she'd ever made at once, obviously, at that point in her life, and she used it for a really good cause, so I thought that was cool. So from there, they talk about Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan had crazy heat, apparently, in the AWA, and he actually broke the nose of Greg Gagne in one of their matches, not intentionally, but one of the fans threw a chair at Heenan, missed, it landed right at fucking Gagne's nose, Greg Gagne's nose, and broke his nose. I think he managed to relocate it, and then Heenan broke it again during the course of their match by accident. So he was a wild man in his AWA days. And he actually ended up wearing the Weasel suit, which was very famous from his WWF run as well, during the Warrior stuff and stuff like that. He had to wear a Weasel suit after losing to Greg Gagne in one of their matches. So I thought that was interesting as well, and it started in the AWA. They also tell the story about how a fan attempted to shoot Bobby Heenan, and he missed, and I think the bullet ricocheted off the guardrail or something, and it injured some fans. They actually never ended up catching who that person was. They tell this absolutely disgusting story, and I'll share this now. Skip ahead by a minute or two if you don't want to hear this story. It's fucking gross. It has to deal with human shit. So this was, they even said, let's cut this out, and of course they kept it in. But Adrian Adonis, they talk about how he had a case of explosive diarrhea on the plane they were talking about earlier, and how Heenan came up with the bright idea. They were an hour away from the airport, I guess, and he just couldn't help himself, and it was a really tight, small plane, rickety plane that people were afraid to fucking fly and that it would crash or whatever. Probably Ric Flair had that same fear as well, I would imagine. So Heenan came up with the idea of holding up a garbage bag to Adonis's ass that he could just shit in. I don't think he realized how bad the poop was until he started shitting on his fucking arm. It was that bad to where it blew the bag. This sounds so gross. It blew the bag away, and the shit landed on Heenan's hands and stuff. He's freaking out. The bag's around somewhere. It's fucking gross, and that's not even the worst of it. So they get to where they are. They left the bag on the plane ultimately. The next people to ride the plane were wondering what that smell was, including Greg Gagne. Mad Dog Vachon finds the bag, puts his fucking head in there, and gets shit all over his face. That is disgusting. That is so fucking gross. Then the real kicker of this episode, the real story that people wanted to hear, the Ken Patera story about how him and Masa Saito were working a show at a local high school gym or whatever, and I think some cold climate. It was freezing. They go to a bar afterward. They drank, had no food. They were starving. So Patera finds the Golden Arches. He finds a McDonald's, and it was really, really late. He goes up to the front door. I've encountered this many, 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 many times on my way back from many wrestling shows, especially in recent years, but especially lately, but really ever. I've had this happen quite a lot, where McDonald's closes at a certain time. A lot of them nowadays, especially after COVID, are not 24 hours anymore. And, the lights might be on. That doesn't mean that they're open. They're just cleaning up or whatever. And he goes up, they're closed. He talks to a worker who says, listen, we closed an hour and a half ago. And Patera sees this whole pile of hamburgers, and he goes, well, what about those? Can't we just have some of those? And this was back when the burgers, he says, were 35 cents a piece. He was actually willing to pay $5 per burger and get $5, get 5 or 6 burgers for him and whoever, which probably wouldn't have been enough. But still, he wanted some of these burgers. They look good. And they said, sorry, we're filming a commercial right now with these burgers. It was a whole platter of stacked up burgers. Regardless, despite that, we can't sell cold food, so I can't even sell them to you even if I wanted to. It's just the rules. So Patera, as he tells the story, is that he was leaving. A kid walks up between 19 and 20 years old and starts shit-talking McDonald's, takes a boulder, a 33-pound boulder, and throws it through the window, shattering the glass, and runs away. Patera obviously was the one who threw the boulder. He refuses to admit that it was him. He called it an ex-employee. That's why the person threw the boulder. And that person was apparently never caught. So kind of throwing some shade on that story there. But, he goes back to his hotel. The police show up at his hotel room. Masa Saito opens the door, and they ask about the burgers. They deny that it was Patera. They claim that the cops maced them anyway. And they get into this big brawl with all these police officers. They're getting the better of the cops. And Saito actually dove on top of one of them, broke this person's leg. 16 more cops show up. All hell breaks loose. They're, Patera's kind of like boasting about, oh, I got the better of the police and I stacked up 10 of them, blah, blah, blah. Kind of like proud of what he did. But, if you read into the real story, as I've heard other people talk about, it's some pretty like brutal shit and some pretty heinous shit that he was accused of as far as attacking these cops and throwing them around like rag dolls, which is not good for something he was definitely guilty of. Regardless, you don't fucking do that even if you're innocent. So ultimately, he said that he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Both of them were 2 years in prison, 6 months, or I think it was 2-year prison and 2 years in prison, 6 years of probation. And I don't think they ended up ever serving the sentence. I don't think they were ever actually served with whatever it was. But he did say here it cost him around $800,000. Obviously, I would assume not at once. But it cost him a lot of money he could be making. So that is fucking nuts. And I love how no one else at this table, hearing this story, buys his bullshit. I thought that was great. The story itself was very concerning. And it was funny to a certain degree when you read up further about it and you find out that these cops were severely hurt. That's not good. But the fact that no one believes him is wonderful. Dick the Bruiser, they tell this quick story about how he came up with this group called the Chain Gang in like 1969, I think. And he wanted to bring the group to Milwaukee. He was warned against it because I guess there were bikers there that did not like the fact they were imitating an actual biker gang or people that were actual bikers, whatever. Despite that, he showed up at a at a bar, and then a brawl broke out. And I guess it was a setup. They get their asses kicked. I think Dick the Bruiser was fine, but his teammates, one of them escaped through the window, ran to a river, right into a river. He jumped out the window into a river, which is crazy. And then one of his other partners in the Chain Gang, a part of this tag team, actually was so viciously attacked he got shot twice in the legs. And I think they never wrestled again after that, which is pretty fucking nuts. As they wind down here, they talk about how the WWF and Vince McMahon Sr. Ended up on HBO, and his son, Vince Jr., the Vince we all know, was, recommending, I guess the promoters were like, listen, don't do this, because if you do this, the territories are done. And then Vince Jr. said, listen, send me your main event matches, we'll air them on HBO to give you more exposure. What he was actually doing was showing these matches to a bigger audience so he could take the talent, make the money, and then buy out these talents. That's exactly what he did. So he wanted to buy out the AWA, and, one of the people that he wanted was Hogan. They took Hogan. Hogan was supposed to be on a Christmas show. Hogan no-showed. Gagne called him up and said, hey, what the hell happened? Hogan said, I signed a contract with the WWF. And he said, well, you got to honor your commitments. I mean, that's just not how it works. And Greg was, Vern, honoring everyone's word, and his word was gold and whatever. And Hogan said, well, he's actually paying me more to sit home. So that really led to the downfall of the AWA, taking not just Hogan, but a lot of their talent, including Bobby Heenan, among others. Medusa in the years that followed, and people like that. A lot of top talent. So they just talked about that and how Hogan was like the first person to break the handshake deal, which I'm not sure how accurate that is. I mean, he said from 1950 to 1983, no one broke the handshake deal that Vern Gagne had with people, which in 33 years, with the way that wrestlers are, I highlight that was the case, but I guess Hogan was the first prominent example of someone breaking the handshake deal. But to close it out, they talk about the AWA's legacy and how it was a top promotion, prior to that point, and in the many years they were running up until the closure at the hands of WWF. So that was that. I thought this was a very fun episode. A lot of varying stories here, some gross stories, some concerning stories, some funny stories, some interesting stories. A nice mix per usual. I'm enjoying the show so far, and I'm looking forward to watching episode 4 and 5 in the days and weeks ahead. So more reviews on those coming soon. There's no set schedule as far as when these episode reviews go up, but I'm hoping to watch them and review them as quickly as I can to kind of catch up to real time. So anyway, guys, have an awesome one. Thank you for checking out this review. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.